What would you do if you could no longer walk, talk, see, or remember, and doctors said nothing more could be done? You would wait. Like the 1 billion people, nearly 1 in 6 worldwide, who suffer from neurological disorders including spinal cord injuries, traumatic brain injuries, stroke, cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's disease. At Burke Neurological Institute, we think patients have waited long enough. We take a dramatically different approach that focuses on repair, not rehabilitation. For a patient with a chronic neurological disability, this could be the difference between never walking again and walking on the beach. Today, 1 in 7 U.S. families are affected by neurological disorders, and current treatments focus solely on rehabilitation and coping. We are fighting to give those families hope. Curing neurological diseases is possible with the help of pioneering donors like you, who can fund the new infrastructure and critical resources needed to bring BNI's full potential to life. Your contribution to BNI will help expand the only neurorestoration institution of its kind into an epicenter for neuroscience research and repair. BNI strengthens hope through science by combining leading-edge research with compassionate care, education, and emotional support. It's a unique environment in which scientists and patients test drive innovative ideas and pursue full function together. BNI is a neuro repair and research arm of Weill Cornell Medicine. Our principal investigators are members of the Weill Cornell faculty. We leverage our connection to Weill Cornell Medicine and others and collaborate worldwide with the best experts in neurology. Together, we are leading the fight to discover ways to repair the brain and spinal cord and develop new treatments to help people walk, talk, see, and remember again. Today, our 4 clinics are already working to help patients recover from cognitive, motor, vision, and sensory deficits. We have begun to develop promising new treatments, but there's more work to do. We need to expand to meet the needs of more patients and their families. The physical structure we envision does not yet fully exist. With your help, our current 45,000 square foot facility will be expanded to increase our laboratory capabilities, foster broader collaboration between researchers and clinicians, and provide patients and families with an unmatched destination for education and support. By helping fund this visionary expansion, you can join the patients who are brave enough to fight with us to ensure a future in which those with debilitating impairments can dare to hope for full recovery. Hope. It's what sustains the patients and families that wait for a cure. And it's what drives us to take a dramatically different approach that brings the best scientific ideas forward and moves patients closer to a cure every day. For patients with chronic neurological diseases, BNI is often their last hope. And with your help, we can tell them the wait is over. Together, we can renew hope for millions.
As you heard in the video, BNI is the only research institute in the US that is dedicated to finding treatments to repair the brain and spinal cord. And the issues are huge. 1 billion people globally and 1 in 7 families in the United States already are suffering from neurological disorders, including stroke, spinal cord injuries, traumatic brain injury, cerebral palsy, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia, and retinal degenerative diseases. So the cause is very, very important, and it's not acceptable to tell people to cope. BNI is fighting every day to find ways to repair and cure the conditions for these people. We're so honored to have Dr. Rajiv Ratan here with us today. He's the CEO of Burke Neurological Institute. He's the Burke Professor of Neurology and Neuroscience and an Associate Dean of Weill Cornell Medicine. He did his training, the MD and the PhD at the NYU School of Medicine. He was a chief resident of neurology at Johns Hopkins. Then he was recruited by Harvard Medical School to head a neuroprotection laboratory, but ultimately recruited from Harvard to head BNI in 2003. Under Dr. Ratan's leadership, BNI has made tremendous strides. Their NIH funding has grown by 600%, and the number of employees has grown from 34 to 110. And the number of Cornell faculty at BNI has increased from 8 to 23. And BNI has received more funding from the New York State Department of Health Spinal Cord Injury Research Program than any of the other 16 medical schools in the state. Not just once, but for the last 6 years in a row. In addition to all these growth business initiatives, Dr. Ratan has been leading a laboratory of research where the focus is on understanding adaptive programs that can facilitate the brain's ability to combat injury and foster repair. We're so honored and grateful that he's taken time out of the schedule of doing all of this stuff to come here today to talk about and help us understand how to decode COVID brain fog. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ratan. Raj, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well,
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, the first question is, so what is brain fog?
Okay. Well, maybe before I get into brain fog, I just wanted to welcome all of you and say good morning. I think we would agree that the last time I did this session 2 years ago, April 3rd, 2020, that we were in a very different place. And there's now time for immense cautious optimism about the virus. The number of people vaccinated in the community is growing. The rate of infection and hospitalization is going down. We have amazing new therapies on the horizon that might, in short order, inhibit the ability of the virus to replicate, much like the therapies for HIV. And so I think that this is a time of tremendous optimism, obviously cautious optimism, but I think despite what we'll talk about today, I think we're really in a new space. The second thing I wanted to say is actually, this is kind of Terry's coming out party. She's joined the BNI board, and we are so grateful to have someone of her stature and talent helping us with our important mission. And then the final thing before we get started is, I think it's worth saying something just to keep our thoughts about the people in Ukraine who are, really have been assaulted in ways that just abhor all of us, and we need to be keeping in mind that our day ahead is far better than what they're experiencing, and we hope that the efforts of the world can bring this to a stop soon. And then with that, I'll get to brain fog. So I'm going to refer to it as brain fog, but brain fog is not a medical term or a diagnosis. It's actually a list of symptoms. And I think that the best way for you to conceptualize this, all of you, is to remember the last time you had a bad flu and how you felt the day after that flu, how hard it was not only to lift your head off the bed, but also to be able to think clearly. And if you can't remember that, then think about the time that maybe the last time you went to London and you flew on the you left here at 10 p.m. at night, arrived in London at 8 a.m. or 7 a.m., got to your hotel by 9 a.m., which is 4 a.m. here in New York, and how you felt as you were arguing with the concierge about the fact that you really needed your room at 9 a.m.
right now.
and it wasn't going to be ready till 4 p.m. And how you dreaded having to sightsee that day after you had no sleep. The also a very common, it's how hard it is to work if you've had an allergy and you're taking antihistamines. And so it refers really to the problems that you might have in finding words or attending to an action that you're taking. And the difference between the brain fog that you experience in COVID as opposed to these conditions is that they're transient. And in COVID, the brain fog appears to be persistent. And we'll talk a little bit about long COVID. What is amazing, and there are lots of reasons for this, is that sometimes the brain fog can actually start to appear more than 3 months after the onset of COVID-19 infection. And part of the reason may be is that some people spend the first 3 months after infection getting over major illnesses, but there are other reasons that may be more sinister and biological that we'll talk about.
Right. So Raj, does everyone who gets COVID get brain fog?
Well, fortunately, the answer is no, but there still are a significant number of people who actually get brain fog after COVID-19. It actually affects 1 in 12 patients after COVID. Now, you might say, well, that's a less. It's actually 8%. And you might say, well, that's not that many. But if you think about it, 80 million people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus. So if you take 8% of 80 million, that's 6.4 million people who suffer brain fog. That's more people in the United States than have Alzheimer's disease right now. So the prevalence of infection in the United States has really made this a public health problem. But it's interestingly, brain fog is seen not only in mild disease, but also severe COVID-19, or although, as you might expect, it's more common in severe COVID-19 infection. It's seen in young people and old people, but again, as you might expect, as you get older, it's more severe. Interestingly, as I talked about before, in 2 out of 5 cases, or 40%, the symptoms actually start after 3 months. There's a growing amount of evidence that this is a real phenomenon and can last weeks, months, and years. And you might say, well, maybe this is just persistence of COVID-19, and actually it's not. There's no evidence of viral persistence. So it's something else, and we'll get to talk a little bit about that.
Okay. So Raj, we've heard a lot about people who were asymptomatic, but had COVID and, were spreading it. That was one of the really scary things. Is there evidence that even people who were asymptomatic 3 months down the road are developing brain fog, or don't we know enough yet to know if that's the case?
See, if they're asymptomatic, they would have had to been diagnosed with COVID-19. And then they would be followed. And I'll talk a little bit about the study, the specific studies that sort of led us to these particular conclusions. Okay. But it's a good question. You have to have somehow sought the attention of a physician, and it has to have gotten into your electronic health record for us to actually monitor.
To know.
So it's a good question.
Okay. So if I had COVID, which thankfully I have not, to my knowledge, and now I think I might have COVID-related brain fog, what should I do now?
Right. So I think one of the important messages today is that, brain fog is, as we talked about, it's a common final pathway of potentially many etiologies. It may not have a single cause. So, as we study it, we really have to make sure that we're not lumping people together who actually don't belong together, because the outcomes then will be different. And really, the first question that we would recommend that one asks with brain fog is it isolated? Is it an isolated symptom, or is it one of a constellation of symptoms that you're experiencing as part of what's called actually long COVID-19 syndrome?
So that phrase, long COVID, and a lot of us, we've all heard segments on the news referring to patients as COVID long haulers. Mm-hmm. What is long COVID? Right.
So I think that there is legitimate concern based now on sound evidence that some people who contract coronavirus disease 219 or COVID-19 do not make a rapid or full recovery. And this is what is the so-called long COVID or long haulers. And this is not a meta-analysis of many studies that you'll hear about. I've taken some of what I think are the best studies, and I'm going to tell you in detail about them. And so I think the best study that I've read actually came from Oxford, and interestingly used patients from the United States, 81 million patients who are part of a they're part of a federated network of electronic health records, really used by a company called Trinetics Analytics. And basically what they do is they have 81 million records from 59 hospitals. And so they're able to identify core features of long COVID. And these features actually reflect the fact that there's not only potentially damage going on in the brain, but there also is damage in many organs. And so what they did in this study is they took they operationally defined long COVID as 9 core features. And they're called features because they're a compilation of symptoms and diagnoses. And they include things like breathlessness, fatigue, malaise, chest and throat pain, headache, abdominal symptoms, myalgia, other pain, cognitive symptoms. And that's kind of the brain fog that we're talking about, and anxiety and depression. And what was fascinating, this is a really beautifully done and controlled study. And it showed that more than 1 out of 3 patients, about 37%, had 1 or more features of long COVID recorded 3 to 6 months after infection. Now, the other thing that makes this study so compelling is what they did is they took as their control group people who had had influenza infection, and they were able to show that all 9 features were more frequently reported in COVID than influenza, but only by 16.6%. And I think this is a really important aspect of this study that we'll come back to again and again during this discussion, because it suggests that maybe if 80% of the people who get influenza are actually going on to develop long COVID syndrome, then it may mean that there's something common about viral infection and what it does to the body. And so I think that this study really codifies the existence of a long COVID syndrome.
So so people with COVID are more likely to be affected with long-term symptoms than people who had influenza, even though, as you point out, it's 16%, not 100%.
Right.
Is it also true that, or is it unique to COVID that these features are showing up 3 to 6 months after the initial infection, or does that happen with influenza as well and nobody paid attention to it because the numbers weren't high?
Right. So the number of patients with symptoms 3 to 6 months after COVID-19 are about 37%, and with influenza it's about 30%. So that's the 16.6% difference in risk, and it really suggests some commonality to viral infection rather than something specific to COVID.
Okay, so back to the question we talked about earlier. If I suspect that I have COVID-related brain fog, what should I do?
Right. So, I think that I'm going to try to provide an intellectual framework for, these are not clinical recommendations, but I want everybody to understand that that actually the first thing that you may want to do is to determine the cause of COVID-related brain fog by asking what non-neurologic symptoms are associated with it. So it's well established, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, that damage to the lungs from COVID can reduce oxygen to the brain. And as everybody knows from Gary Gibson's work at BNI, that oxygen is critical in the brain for generating ATP energy that's required for our brains to function. If you have damage to the heart from COVID, you may not be getting adequate blood flow to the brain. Or if you have damage to the kidneys, it can cause reduced excretion of waste, which can affect the brain. What I'm gonna do is to talk more in more detail about the lungs, because I think it can help you conceptualize how COVID-19 specifically affects the ability of oxygen to get to different tissues. So this is on the left. I don't know if you can see my pointer, or maybe you.
I can
on
point
the
for
left,
you.
Yeah. So where it says good. That's great. The lungs.
Teamwork.
You can see, right. You can see the trachea and the bronchi, and then the bronchioles, and they ultimately lead to what's called the respiratory unit. That's the second figure, and you can see where the capillaries are blue. This is blood that's non-oxygenated, and there are what are called alveoli. These are air-filled sacs that are very thin that communicate with the blood, and that's the way oxygen goes into the blood. And you can see that the blood is going from being blue to red, and it's exchanged for CO2. So every time you breathe in oxygen, and every time you breathe out this toxic CO2 that is important in blood balance. Now, normally what happens is that in the alveoli wall, there's no yellow line there, which is fibrosis that can develop from COVID. And when that wall isn't there, then oxygen diffuses into the capillary. It's captured by the red blood cells. Those red blood cells then take oxygen to every tissue in the body. Now, the brain is 2% of our body weight, but it uses 20% of our oxygen and glucose.
Wow.
And so its demands on oxygen are much higher than any other organ. So if you don't have enough oxygen that's getting to the brain, and this might not be, it might not be severe, it may be mild, especially if you have other comorbid problems like vascular disease or a low hemoglobin, it can cause brain fog. And in fact, patients with idiopathic fibrosis, this yellow line you see that kind of causes the oxygen molecules to bounce off the capillary wall rather than being diffused through it. Brain fog is a very, very common sequelae of that. So it's important to understand whether you have these types of problems, and you need to see an internist or a PCP who can help exclude these sometimes manageable conditions. Because if the fibrosis is very limited and not very diffuse and mild, then sometimes giving people oxygen or raising their red blood count can actually help with this problem. So it's maybe seen as an example of a more reversible cause of COVID-related brain fog. Next.
Okay, so first step is to seek out expert medical attention to understand whether any COVID has damaged any of these other organs.
Right.
And the secondary symptom cause you're seeing is the brain fog, right?
Exactly.
So, okay. So once you do that, what if you're told that the problem isn't in the heart, lungs, or kidneys? Then what?
Right. So then, it's important to realize that there are other that sometimes CNS or nervous system related symptoms that also provide an explanation or a treatment for brain fog. And one of the things that is astounding about this Oxford study that took these health records from the United States is that the incidence, the single entity, and these entities were defined by what are called ICD-10 codes. This is a World Health Organization classification for diseases and symptoms and related health problems. And if you look at the risk of chronic pain in patients with COVID-19, it is the only category where you see increasing incidence over time, where the incidence in 3 to 6 month epoch is greater than the 1 to 3 month epoch. And that affects 34% of the people who have COVID-19. Now, so if we go back to our 80 million count of people who've had COVID in the United States, that is 30 million people. That is a daunting number of people who are having chronic pain from after COVID infection. And chronic pain, as you know, it prevents you from sleeping. It prevents you from sleeping appropriately. Sometimes you're taking other medications for it, and that can be a great source of brain fog. So if you can get the pain treated, then maybe the brain fog will go away.
Raj, can I stop you there?
Yeah.
Because that's, I mean, first of all, that's terrifying. Is the pain specific? Does it show up in certain locations, right, or is it all over the place and just like evidence of the body being attacked everywhere?
Right. So
that's a huge number.
Yeah, the reason why it's such a huge number is because there are many sources of chronic pain in COVID-19. So it can come, people develop chest or throat pain afterwards, maybe because of the direct result of infection of COVID-19. They can develop pain related to insults that may happen to the brain or inflammation that happens in the body. Some people have a PTSD, a post-traumatic stress disorder, that may lead to an increased risk of COVID-19. Other people have had, you have abdominal pain or other pain that's emerged from actually being in the ICU. So there are lots of different causes, and that's why it's even more important to see somebody who can evaluate for what those causes might be. So the next most prominent group of symptoms is actually patients who have anxiety and depression. And again, depression, as you know, is characterized often by hopelessness and then vegetative signs that might be decreased eating or decreased sleeping or increased sleeping. Depression can often be associated with what's called a pseudodementia, which can involve attentional deficits and word-finding problems that are characteristic of brain fog. And then the third thing I wanted to mention, so depression can be treated. I did want to mention in the issue about chronic pain that Diana Willis and her group with Pete Goldstein at Weill are really looking at this in terms of nervous system. So it's an area that we have some interest in. But depression can also be treated with medicines, and I'll talk about it a little more. Gary Gibson, working with Dr. Nordvig, has been very interested in neurogenesis and newborn neurons in the brain, and that may be what causes this depression. Finally, I wanted to point out a study that came from Weill Cornell, where they looked at how likely is it that a patient will have a stroke after COVID-19, again, using influenza as a control. And although there are some differences in the severity of illness of this population, the risk of an ischemic stroke after COVID-19 is 7.5 times higher, still low, but 7.5 times higher with COVID than with influenza. So so you need to go and see a neuropsychiatrist or someone who can evaluate these different problems and see whether they might be a cause of your brain fog, because they also have a different set of treatments than isolated brain fog.
So a lot of navigating the healthcare system and proactively, and this information helps. What's next?
Right. So I thought I would provide you, again, an intellectual framework for thinking about how I would approach the problem if I had brain fog, given what we know in the literature. So let's say you have brain fog, and again, remember that's a problem with attention or concentrating. Maybe you were able to do 10 crossword puzzles in a day, and now you can only do 3. And you see a physician, and who can evaluate whether you have end organ damage, like to your lung, heart, your kidney, maybe your GI tract. And if the evidence of those is found, then you can pursue non-neurologic treatment options, like I described with the interstitial lung infection, where you would be trying to increase oxygenation of the blood and deliver it to the brain. And the hope would be that those treatments would then reverse the brain fog that you might be feeling. If no evidence of end organ damage is found, then you might see a physician, a neurologist, a psychiatrist, or a neuropsychiatrist who could help you to evaluate whether you have chronic pain, anxiety, depression, or a new stroke. Again, because if you do, those specific entities are associated with potential treatments that are in our clinical armamentarium that could reverse the brain fog. But maybe the group that we're most interested in studying is the patients who have isolated brain fog with no other symptoms, and that's where there are current approaches that are being taken that haven't been validated, but there's also lots of research on novel therapies, and I see that this is actually one of them. I don't know, Terry, did you want to focus this at all, or?
No, well, it's very complicated, right? And so the framework is incredibly helpful to put it in perspective. But if you do reach this point where you suspect or feel that you've been able to confirm at this point in time that the cause of your brain fog is COVID related, given where we are in the course of the pandemic, the question is, okay, what do I do? Or what do I tell my loved ones to do? And so,
right. So one, I think the recommendations that a number of physicians are providing these days is, these ideas that you would use factors that generally control prevention of brain disease. In fact, factors that have been very clearly from epidemiologic studies known to reduce the incidence of dementia. And these activities are aerobic exercise, eating a vascular or Mediterranean diet, one with olive oil, vegetables, other types of diets that are good, are known as vascular diets, to reduce alcohol and drugs if you're taking any of those things, to figure out are you sleeping well, and if not, how can you get help to improve your sleep. That includes things like not looking at your phone the hour before you're going to sleep, or having a lot of stimulation, and then participating in social activities. One of my professors from Hopkins, Guy McCann, he and his wife used to do this thing on staying sharp for the Dana Foundation, and they go out. And I did some of these. We'd go out in the community and talk about how to stay sharp as you get older. And he would say, go to the mall, and I would just add to that: go to the mall, walk around, see people. Just don't go to the Cinnabon. Isn't that right? You want to keep Mediterranean diet going. So I think the message is that right now these kinds of things are being seen as tractable, but they haven't been validated. And it is an important reminder that basic lifestyle choices may be critical to maintain or regain our health after COVID. But this has not undergone rigorous study.
Right. So lots of questions, right?
Right.
No magic bullet, which of course is what we particularly in the US want, right? We want a pill, whatever. Are there studies underway to help us identify more specific treatment options related to brain fog in COVID? The study that you cited earlier reflects what, 6 months of
Yes.
following?
Mhm.
Are there other studies underway?
There are many studies that have recently come out. One of the issues with many of those studies is some of them come out from the VA population, which is about 88% men, but many studies that are affirming the existence of long COVID. I think one of the things that I've noticed is, and what I liked about the Oxford study was that they had an influenza control group, and they actually had a negative control group in looking at atopic dermatitis. And what was really assuring is that there's no increased risk of atopic dermatitis. It's a condition of the skin related to allergic inflammation of the skin. And the risk ratio between those who had COVID and influenza was indistinguishable, and it was 1. So I think you have to be careful, because a lot of the information that we get in the literature doesn't always critically evaluate the methods that were used to achieve the conclusions that are being told.
Which is why we see, over the years, right? This diet works, that diet works, this diet doesn't work, this is good for you, this is bad for you.
Right.
And one of the reasons why we're so grateful to have you here today to help us see through some of that fog, no pun intended, to these recommendations though, right? I mean, we all know this is the stuff that we're supposed to be doing. That doesn't necessarily make it any easier. Are there, and I know that the validation isn't completely there, but in your expert opinion, is there one of these things that's more important than the others to pursue in terms of COVID-related brain fog?
Right. So I think you raise an important point, and I would say that my expert opinion is meaningless. That I would always say that we try at BNI to always be driven by data, because I will tell you, and I think Fred Maxfield taught this to me early, our best hypotheses are going to be ultimately wrong. And so you really need to be testing and evaluating these therapies in a rigorous way before you can decide whether they work or not. So I think these are tractable things to do. It makes sense because there's clear epidemiological data that these 5 things together can dramatically reduce your risk of dementia, and I think that's by extension. But if somebody has interstitial lung disease, they're not going to be able to do aerobic exercise. And if somebody has pain, they're not going to be able to sleep well. So I think it also highlights why people really need to get treatments.
Okay. Can you just talk a little bit about the social activities point and the science that we know of why it helps and what's
Right.
going on?
Yeah, I think it's an epidemiological study. I don't think, I think again, it's why these are sort of soft. And and I think it's just clear that people who have supportive families and a network of friends generally do better than people who are isolated. And sometimes the tendency is that when we have an illness, we tend to internalize it, and instead of reaching out to our support systems, we isolate ourselves. So I think that that's probably the reason.
Okay. So clearly, given the delay in the onset of the symptoms of long COVID, right? But probably more importantly, the desperate fight to just save lives in the early stages of the pandemic. There's been limited opportunity to validate the findings and to scientifically prove what's really gonna help and what's really going on. But now that we're in a better place, as you say, and we have learned more, what can you tell us about the research efforts that are underway and moving forward, and help us understand, sort of what we might learn going from here?
Right. So I think one of the important take-home messages today is that brain fog is likely not a single disease, but the question is in circumstances where people have florid COVID infection, maybe, and in this case, due to specifically to lung disease, what can we learn about what's going on in the brain, particularly from those people who have tragically passed away, really from really cutting edge techniques that allow us to identify gene changes and protein changes. And there's a fantastic study that was published by Tony Wiscare's group at Stanford, where they were able to obtain brains from those who died from COVID, one who died from influenza, and a group of patients who died for other reasons that are unrelated to brain disease. And they were able to actually look for evidence of, and these are people who ultimately died of a pulmonary failure, so lung problems, but they were able to look at the brains and say, is there evidence of, in somebody who's floridly infected, is there evidence of COVID-19 in the brain? And the answer was that, and many of these people died several weeks after the onset of COVID, there was no molecular evidence of COVID-19 in the brain. No RNA or protein could be found. And these same beautiful studies, which were published in a paper in Nature that I'm happy to share, the references here, showed that what's happening is when you have a florid systemic infection, that what the brain is doing is it's mobilizing its antiviral defenses at its borders. So all the areas that are normally important for trafficking, like the choroid plexus, trafficking substances from the periphery into our brain, they kind of put their walls up. They lock the doors, they consolidate the junctions, they increase protein, antiviral defense proteins that essentially shut down the borders. And then what they do is they then send inflammatory signals into the brain through a group of chemokines that are known as either CXCL chemokines or CCL chemokines, that then activate robust inflammatory responses in the brain, particularly not in the neurons, but the supporting cells of the neurons called astrocytes and microglia. And they found even infiltration from the periphery of immune cells that are called T cells. Now you might say, well, why is this happening? Why would the brain signal all this inflammation? Well, I think the reason this is happening, and again, this last point speaks to that, is that when the brain gets the signal that the virus is lingering out in the periphery, what it's telling the brain to do is to shut down all its activities, because viruses require cell synthesis machinery of proteins and other things in order to replicate. And so if the brain is shut down, then it no longer becomes a fertile ground for viral spread. And so the way to look at all this inflammation is it's telling the many, many different cells of the brain to shut down their activities, because there's a huge viral infection going out there outside our borders, and we don't want it. We want to make sure that the brain is not a vital
Hunker
place.
down, right?
Yeah.
Hunker down and don't be a target. Wow.
Exactly. And you actually see loss of not synaptic plasticity genes, but actually synaptic function genes. And the question really is the unanswered question is this is actually a set of studies that's done after very severe acute infection. But the question becomes, now, once you've set this up, is there a switch that's flipped that now says, oh, this is such a severe attack on the body that I'm going to keep my defenses going for the foreseeable future? Or alternatively, is it that very mild infections from other things that you might get, let's say 3 to 6 months after the onset of COVID, might actually trigger the reactivation of this inflammatory response, whereas it doesn't in someone who's normal?
Okay. So that was from a Stanford study. Can you tell us what research is happening at BNI?
Right. Yeah. So I think I wanted to mention, and this is a very BNI focused. I'm not usually the self-promoting, but I think I'm really excited about things that are going on at BNI, and I wanted to tell you about them at the risk of overwhelming you with a long list. So as I mentioned, Dr. Gibson and Nordvig are examining the effect of a drug called benfotiamine, which delivers thiamine into the brain. And Gary has some exciting preliminary results that this may be effective in Alzheimer's disease, and that maybe it works in animals through increasing neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons in the brain. And this birth of new neurons is critical not only for treating depression, but also for optimizing cognitive function. I don't think they have applied this to brain fog after COVID, but I'm wondering if they could. So Dr. Prusky, along with Mooney and Alam, are developing novel, rapid techniques for visual attention. This illustration on the right is just a young person who's is using their platform, which is called Gradiate, which may allow you to be able to go from rather sort of gross qualitative measures of brain fog to actually a quantitative measure, and that would greatly enhance studies. Some studies that are going on in my own lab in collaboration with Dr. Lee Gann at Weill, Carlo Corona has found in my lab that if you acutely activate the antiviral responses in the brain, that the areas normally involved in learning and memory are really diminished. And we think that has to do with the same idea of shutting down the macromolecular synthesis machinery so that the viruses can't replicate, but at the same time, it prevents you from learning new things. So there are actually, and the pathways involved in that, a DNA sensor called CGAS and a adapter protein called STING are actually targets for reversing this chronic activation of this immune response that may be inappropriate. And I mentioned it before, but not here. Diana Willis's work on chronic pain may be very relevant to the millions of people who are experiencing chronic pain.
Well, the chronic pain thing is so critical, right? Because of the opioid crisis. So the tool that physicians had clearly does more harm than good. So Diana's work is so critical. But just to make sure that we understand the work that your lab is doing in layman's terms, so that that fight of the brain that the brain is putting up as the virus tries to invade can cause inflammation. There's sort of the results of that fight. And is your work looking at how to stop the fight when the battle is won, or clear up the mess? What in very layman's terms, what is your research focused on?
Right. So I think the idea is that when if the brain gets signals that it may be under threat of a viral infection, it has endogenous adaptive responses that it activates to defeat that virus. And those responses involve the shutting down of the machinery of the brain that actually is involved in helping us learn or be attentive.
Okay.
And so you're absolutely right. It is the inappropriate persistence of that antiviral response that may be a cause of brain fog. And
Okay.
so if you develop drugs that can actually block that or inhibit it or return it to baseline, then the hypothesis is that you would be able to treat the
Okay.
brain fog post-COVID.
Okay, we
And-
are running out of time, and we have had so many great questions from the audience. And Christine has been following them for us, and I would like to give her the floor so that she can share some of those questions. Christine, you're on mute though.
Right. So can I just can you back up to that one slide? I just want to
Of
make sure that
course.
because I want to say that I think one of the challenges now is that people really I think the public, our politicians have to realize that this is a huge public health threat, and our clinical services need to be prepared and resourced to manage these long COVID features, really according to the best available evidence. And I think I've presented some of that evidence too. So now go ahead, sorry.
No, you're absolutely right. And also, and people need to be prepared, which is why we had this, right? To force that, to try to force that care and help, right? Because it's incredibly complicated.
Absolutely.
Okay. So Christine, questions.
So here we have some questions, and I think we should start out with Dr. Maxfield actually brought up the point, Raj, if you can talk a little bit about, maybe just give some broad strokes about the immune response with COVID, so people have a little layman sort of context.
Right. Maybe I'll focus this in the way and say that the immune response in the brain is mediated through non-neural cells like astrocytes and microglia that are supporting cells. And they kind of not only provide normally the neurons with substrates to optimize their function, but under many conditions, viral encephalitis, multiple sclerosis, these different cells get activated, and they're able to regulate not only they're able to regulate neuronal activity and neuronal function, and the idea is that they're probably there in the beginning as something that's going to protect the brain, but their persistence in the context of many neurodegenerative diseases is actually maladaptive. And interestingly, so the activation of astrocytes and microglia in the brain of patients with COVID is unique, but it also shares features with the activation of genes that are seen in diseases like Alzheimer's disease and ALS and autism. And it's thought that maybe these common pathways may reflect a common path of neurodegeneration, but this requires a lot more study. And I think it does have implications for the long-term effects of COVID-19 on potentially the incidence of neurodegenerative diseases. So I hope that answers the question. Right.
Thank you. Thanks. And there's also been a few questions about vaccinations. And Mark, I'm going to paraphrase yours a little bit to sort of join in with a few others that have been asked. But basically, there's quite a few folks wondering, can somebody experience brain fog from, let's say, vaccinations? Have you heard
Great
anything?
question. Yeah. So there's a guy named Avi Nath. He used to be at Hopkins. He's now at the NIH, and he's really been trying to study patients who have experienced lots of neurological symptoms after having a vaccination. These are really anecdotal case reports. There's a relatively small number of patients. But the NIH is very, very interested in studying them, and they've used some experimental treatments to suppress the immune system. Sometimes what you can do is you can give steroids, or you could give intravenous immunoglobulins, and those haven't seemed to have much effect. So I think there is a great interest in this, and Avi is an expert neurovirologist, so, and the head of the clinical center at the NINDS and the National Institutes of Neurological Diseases and Stroke. And so I think he will get to the bottom of it, but the data is very murky at this point. And I would say it's not, given the number of people, the overwhelming evidence is that the vaccination benefit far outweighs the vaccination cost.
Thank you.
So, okay, Christine, you want one more?
Sure. So I think this is a good question and something that we all think about and struggle with, Dr. Ratan. Does stress or additional stress, does that intensify the symptoms of brain fog or even chronic pain? Will we see, sort of a more intense effect with increased stress?
Well, I think chronic stress, I think the answer is yes. Chronic stress is, and it's probably why, this is a point I meant to make earlier, psychiatrists in our society have never been busier, because many people who never had COVID-19 are stressed. They're isolated, they're not getting out. We sort of miss the routine of all the social interactions that we've had. But chronic stress not only can develop into post-traumatic stress disorder, but also it can give rise to depression. And all of those things can contribute to brain fog. I think what we need to be doing is we need to be providing more for patients. We need to recognize what are the quantifiable features that allow us to diagnose that stress and understand at a biological level what its contributions are. Because I think, and one would argue that the 5 things that we talked about as treatments all reduce stress, but it's used in far too vague a way for us to ultimately understand what the critical biological interactions are that ultimately, I think, distill into finite treatments.
Well, I want to be respectful of people's time and your time, Dr. Ratan. I think it's worthwhile to remind everybody of the key takeaways that we had here today in terms of what we have learned, and I'm not going to read these off, right? But there's some important things that have been proven, at least by scientifically validated research so far, and we're understanding more. The current recommended treatment options, as much as some of us might want a magic bullet, there isn't one, and we need, hopefully this is additional motivation to do the things that we know we need to do anyway. And if you're doing some of them, great, try to do more of them. And that there is critically important research underway, and we need to pay attention and rely on experts like yourself to help us see through and summarize and incorporate those treatments and get the help that we and our loved ones need. I guess I'd ask you for one final comment on all of this. You started out putting this in perspective. Remind us again what the good news is in terms of where we are here.
Well, the good news is I think we're beginning to codify through really rigorous research that long COVID is not in people's heads, so to speak, but it's actually a real entity, and but that it's many entities. And that the other thing I would say that's really important to take away is that those with severe influenza may be experiencing the same types of symptoms. So it's a reason not only to be vaccinated from COVID-19, but it's also a reason to be vaccinated from flu. But the other thing is that the incidence of COVID-19 is so much higher that these lingering problems really are resulting in a really pressing public health issue, and we need to mobilize the resources to not only to have surveillance for these problems and understand what their causes might be.
Okay. Well, thank you. We should end with a reminder of the incredibly important, critical work that BNI does every single day, fighting for patients to find ways to repair the brain and spinal cord. And if you'd like to learn more about BNI, about the research going on, about current clinical trials that are being run and are recruiting patients, please visit the website burke.weill.cornell.edu and join BNI in the the fight to help the 1 in 7 US families already affected by neurological disease. And then finally, thank you, Dr. Ratan, for your time, for everybody for attending today. And the recording will be available, but we hope it was insightful and helpful, and greatly appreciate everyone's time.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. This is a great discussion, and you helped us so much in creating this type of venue. We're going to be doing this with many faculties, so hopefully this is going to be a regular part of our webinars. But thank you again, and Christine and Bree.
And Bree, absolutely. All right, signing off, everyone.